Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. Review. This presentation intends to look at George Magnus's 4 theses: debt, demography, the renminbi, and the middle income trap, that are hurdles that Xi faces in dealing with China, and provide my own analysis and thoughts. I had the fortune to interview George Magnus a couple of weeks ago and put some of his ideas to the test. Let's jump right in. The book is extremely well written, and every paragraph is, you could almost do a PhD thesis with, if you just took that paragraph's wealth of detail and research. Well, many books about China take a sensationalist view, such as Gordon Chang's The Coming Collapse of China, been in reprint since 2001. It still hasn't quite got there. This is really a really strong economic analysis, and George Magnus just lays out those economic facts, heavy fact after heavy fact, and puts a very strong case that China faces some serious problems. I will provide my own analysis. I'm not an economist by training, but feel that some of his ideas do stand up to further scrutiny. The first of his ideas is that debt is kicking in to China, and it's going to kick in hard. We're seeing a perfect example of that with the property companies such as Evergrande, where their debts are catching up with them. And this has been in the news for years. I mean, it feels like 10 years where there's been this knowledge of a property bubble, and it's only finally coming home to roost. The question there is, why does it take so long? I think it's because China is so big that it's such a vast economy, it just takes longer for things to filter through the system and for the sort of negative feedback to come out. But as we're seeing with Evergrande, and as George Magnus describes, the idea of going bust is, how does it happen? At first, very slowly, and then very quickly. And if you've seen Evergrande's problems and the debt repayments due, it's just getting worse and worse. And George Magnus's overall contention is that with the entire economy, there are problems like this taking place. And a good example is much of the property debts are financed by regional banks. And those regional banks themselves are financed 30% by the interbank overnight rate, which, while interest rates might be quite low at the moment, is extremely risky. The big difference, and why there won't be a sort of catastrophic Lehman-style collapse with China, is that their economy is effectively closed, so they can manage the fallout. But the dodgy lending runs vast and deep, and all of these debts are starting to come home. Another example is financing of the high-speed rail, which the idea, I believe, is that the debt gets inflated away over the long lifespan of the railway, but those debts are gradually becoming due, and the earnings from say the passengers on the railway are really not enough to cover the interest on those loans, let alone the principal. So while China can manage a full-scale contagion, it is more heading in the direction, I would argue, of zombification, and the government sort of starts to prop up everything, and it just gets slower and slower, and effectively the whole country becomes a giant SOE, and we know how inefficient those SOEs are. The scarier scenario, and what we are starting to see creep in at the moment, is what if house prices start dropping and you end up in a sort of negative equity situation. The prospect of a property tax is also meaning property prices might drop because people are selling because they don't want to pay that tax, and you can see how it ends up in a vicious circle. To address the debt problem, one of the challenges she faces is the vested interests. Obviously, these big property groups have lots of control in the CCP. Trying to manage them will be hard. Also, everyone owns a property. You don't want people's main store of savings to lose value, because you will end up with instability. The idea she is intending to do is to shift the economy substantially, structurally away from property. Property makes up about 25 to 30% of the economy, and the shift will be towards consumption and services. This is the idea of common prosperity. It's tied up with the idea of the 3-child policy, slashing education costs so that you can have more children and consume more, introducing new governance systems, use of robots to increase productivity. But as we see, the debt and demography issues really run up against it. I put this question to George Magnus, whether it is possible to shift it over. He was saying, yes, it's completely possible, and it would easily cover the 30% gap if they just stopped the property part of the economy tomorrow. But the structural shifts are absolutely vast and hard to implement. My thinking is they can probably shift it over, but we'll see a fairly epic period of stagnation where things just go a lot slower. As a comparison, you have the USSR in the 1950s, where they industrialised the economy. China's sort of been through that. You build a house, you build factories, you build power plants, you build highways, all of this stuff. But once you've got them, you can't do the same again. And whereas building a house is 0 to 100, adding insulation or making it green power consumption is 100 to 105. It's not as massive a leap. So debt is going to be a drag on the Chinese economy. Demography is the second argument. And the classic adage is that China will grow old before it grows rich. The one-child policy seems to have inflicted a fairly spectacular demographic deficit that China faces. And the population structure is an inverted pyramid. And the idea there is that within 30 years, possibly less, the country will have only one member of the working age population for every 2 retirees. So that's only one person working to pay for 2 people not working. And bear in mind, those 2 people not working will be getting older and iller as time goes on, it's going to be a huge social care cost. The gravity of the situation didn't hit me until I heard it from a Chinese who said that she is about 35, an only child. Her mother is one of 5, all of whom married and had 1 child each. But of her generation, my teacher's generation, only of those 5 couples, only 1 couple has had 1 baby. So fast forward 30 years and you have that 1 baby working while all those 5 couples, 10 people are effectively going into retirement, and if age goes up, potentially their parents of the couples will be aged about 90 themselves. They'll still be alive, but that 1 working age population will have to support those up to 20. So you can see the demographic crisis happening. In further detail, bear in mind that a retirement home in China costs about £500 a month, and that the average middle income salary in China is about £500. You can see the problems that will arise. Medical care, bills for these old people will be a massive drag on the economy. That said, this could tie into the structural shift of the economy away from property towards consumption and services. Looking after all those old people will provide jobs and income and a new role for the economy. And bear in mind, China is so big, there will still be about 400 million people working to support up to 800 million retirees. So, massive economy. It's still got the capacity to cope. Question is, yes, how are they going to cope to fill the gap of looking after the elderly? Will robots do it? Will they have immigration? Highly unlikely in China, very ethnocentric. So that demographic issue is a major one, and I think probably the heaviest hitting of George Magnus's red flags. Next up is the renminbi. I won't go into the details here because it involves some fairly complex economics that I struggle to understand. But the idea is that China wants to internationalise its currency as much as the dollar or euro so that it can challenge dollar supremacy. But for various structural reasons, basically capital controls means that it's impossible. At the same time, floating the currency would probably result in capital flight because people want to get their cash out of China into more secure regimes. Also, the cost of floating the currency means the renminbi will could appreciate, and as is already happening in China, its export market is no longer valuable. And arguably one of the reasons she is going ahead with dual circulation and sort of shutting off the economy means that with a closed economy, they can weather the storm of some of these problems. Effectively, the manufacturing can provide the domestic market, and it ties into this idea of self-sufficiency. Reasons the currency wouldn't be as well trusted: lack of democratic accountability, rule of law, certainty of a peaceful transfer of power means that the currency carries a certain risk premium. I've mentioned manufacturing becoming less competitive, although might robots be able to make up that shortfall? But the question there is, well, why would people manufacture in China using robots when they could just use robots in their own country? One possible way Xi is challenging the renminbi problems is by locking in other countries to trade using the renminbi. And this is what we're seeing with the advance of the digital yuan. It's arguably like crypto, but boring. And the aim of China would be to make it mandatory that all trade with China is yuan only. I think this will have some success, but as with other Chinese exports like WeChat Pay, it just hasn't worked. Alibaba similarly hasn't really worked. TikTok, a good example of a Chinese company that has worked. What if they suddenly started offering yuan payments globally throughout their system? That would be interesting. So the renminbi is a problem. My feeling is that China will get much of the developing world to trade in the renminbi, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, but that it won't supplant the dollar's supremacy. Next up, and probably the most interesting of George Magnus's arguments, is the idea of the middle income trap that faces China. Now, there are arguments that exist debating whether the middle income trap even exists itself, whether it's just a sort of figment of a scholar's imagination and a trendy term. I wax and wane whether it exists, and actually my ultimate argument is that China won't. It doesn't matter for China. But assuming that it does exist, let's take a look. China is already tackling the middle income trap with the idea of getting out of basic manufacturing into high-end and services to become an economy more like South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, that sort of thing. Become a sort of high-end, high-value economy. And I think it's got some potential here. Its aim is to become the services hub of the developing world. So all those African countries will have high-end goods made in China or services provided by China, such as finance. Again, I think China will potentially be shut out of the rich world, so it won't achieve the highs of other countries, but within its own framework it will become effectively high income. Now, why do countries get stuck in the middle income trap? The ideas are very much tied up with the book by Acemoglu, Why Nations Fail. And it all comes down to TFP, total factor productivity, which is hard to put your finger on, but it's essentially institutions. Institutions can help increase productivity. Arguably, the party might be trying to institutionalize its own way of doing things and providing TFP, as one recent book I read called Retrofitting Leninism. They might be trying to create those institutions in their own special way. I think China can avoid the middle income trap, but not in the sense of becoming a massively high value economy, because it's so big. Again, China has 600 million people who earn £115 a month. China doesn't really need to bother with making its wealthy coastal cities wealthier at the moment. But if it brought up those 600 million, if it doubled their incomes, as a collective whole, China's economy will just have the weight to do what it likes. And I'd almost argue that it's in the party's interests not to have super high earners, because they are essentially a threat to its own rule. Now, going on a brief excursus, a contrarian argument here could be that for China, most people say it should democratise because of the benefits of freedom. I would argue the benefits are economic, and actually the cost that China currently bears of repression and its autocratic way of doing things is far more than the cost of running a democratic state. I have not gone into the numbers here, but if anyone would like to let me know, I'd be fascinated to see whether it is technically cheaper to run the state apparatus of a democracy rather than an autocracy. But the cost of repression, I feel, for example, cost of policing in Xinjiang is over 3 times the cost of Guangdong. Surely there's a better way to do it, and advancing total factor productivity reforms means China could end up a lot better off. So forget freedom, China. Democracy is about the economy, and it could be doing much better. So I feel like the party almost wants the middle income trap for the majority of the population, because if they're too wealthy, then they're a threat to the party. There's another good article by Asamoglu that details the cost to elites of repression is ultimately cheaper than the cost of reform in certain countries. In certain countries where the cost isn't too bad, usually where the Gini coefficient isn't too high, democratizing is costly for the elite but not totally damaging. I think the current state in China is actually the elite are so wealthy it is cheaper for them, for the elite, to repress than to reform. So they will maintain the situation as it is. The income gap is too great. But the point of the middle income trap, I don't feel like it will affect China so much, again, because it's such a vast economy, and that distorts the way China works in relation to other countries. So, to conclude, debt, demography, renminbi, and middle income traps. are all huge hurdles for Xi to leap over. The current switch to common prosperity does seem to go a long way towards tackling them. The question is, can it fully address them? And can those reforms actually go all the way through, bearing in mind it involves a lot of economic damage to get there? My arguments are China will effectively muddle through because of its size, its use of the developing world to prop up its own economy, and certain common prosperity reforms will help. So I feel like if you measured China on Western or developed economies, no, it won't properly address these problems. But as with everything in China, you sort of move the goalposts and redefine things so that all of these situations, like having a closed economy, means that China can redefine the parameters and sort of get away with things. So ultimately, reading George Magnus's book, I think he highlights the critical issues. Whether they really come home to roost, we will see in the next 5 to 10 years. Thanks for watching. Please let me know your thoughts.